Greetings, this is Greg. During the late 1950s through the early 1960s, New York's Idlewild Airport, now known as JFK, was one of the nation's most important airports for international travel. The people who ran the airport decided that each airline should have not only its own terminal, but should design it as well. Regardless of the intent of that plan, the result was a collection of terminal buildings, each trying to outdo the others in grandeur and each in its own unique style. At the time, Pan American, or Pan Am, was the leading airline in international travel. They built their terminal called the Worldport. As you can see, it was spectacular in its time. There wasn't anything like it before or since. Not only did it look great, it was practical. Planes could be parked under the giant saucer section, allowing a lot of the operation to be sheltered from the weather, including refueling, catering, baggage handling, and more. The hub-and-spoke nature of the terminal and its gates allowed passengers and personnel to move from one gate to another with minimal distance covered. Pan Am Airlines is long gone. There were attempts to preserve the Worldport as a historical site. However, the reality is that space at JFK is at a premium. It is a functioning international airport after all, and like most other airport buildings of the time, the Worldport was destroyed in the name of progress. One of the other prominent airlines of the era was TWA, Trans World Airlines. They also built a fantastic terminal at JFK. It was called the TWA Flight Center. Thankfully, it's still here, well, most of it is, and this building is the subject of this video. We will go through the building itself and lightly touch on various exhibits and historical vehicles and equipment contained within. The facility was comprised of the main building you see here. Notice in this picture we have a tube extending from the building. That acts as an enclosed pedestrian bridge. There are two of them. They connect to a pair of satellite terminals. Those satellite terminals are long gone, but the main building and the tubes are still there. Let's look at some other vintage pictures before we go inside. TWA, the airline, is long gone. The reason for the demise of Pan Am and TWA are both too complex for this video. It's really another subject. But the short version is that neither airline could adapt to the changes after airline deregulation in 1978. I really hate to call it deregulation. That is the commonly used and correct term, but the truth is it was re-regulation. One set of regulations was replaced with another, and some airlines just couldn't adapt to the new business environment. Back to our TWA Flight Center. Here it is today. It's now the TWA Hotel. After sitting abandoned for about 2 decades, it was refurbished and made into a 1960s themed hotel which displays a surprising amount of vintage artifacts. It's basically a museum in all but name. They built 2 new wings which contain the hotel rooms. I'll put a white arrow here to point out one of those new wings. The wings are connected through new T-intersections into the original above-ground pedestrian bridges. The original ends of those pedestrian bridges or tubes are still there, but they now connect to a new terminal, the JetBlue terminal. So not only is this a functioning hotel, it's a functioning airport hotel that still connects to a functioning terminal as it did originally. You may notice that in this picture there are 3 historical cars in front of the building. I'll zoom in a bit. There are 3 more inside, and of course we'll talk about each one as we get to them. Notice the blue VW bus, as I'll be using it for a location reference to help us keep oriented later. I originally tried to make this video as a full motion walkthrough, but abandoned that plan, went with more of a slideshow format with only a few videos within. There were 2 problems with the video format. First, it's hard to hold the cell phone steady enough. Second, everywhere in this hotel there's music playing, which means I would have had to delete any live narration to avoid copyright issues. So here we go. We've just left the current passenger terminal and are walking through the tube to the main building. Notice the light to the right. That's where the cutout is for the new section leading to one of the wings within the hotel rooms. Those rooms, which have a solid 1960s theme, are really reminiscent of staying in a 60s hotel. Other than the Wi-Fi and flat screen TV, they look right out of 1964. Each room even has a functioning rotary dial phone. We've exited the tube, and right in front of us is a circular bar, which is closed at the moment. To get oriented here, I'm adding some arrows. At arrow 1, you can see that blue VW bus again. That's located at the main entrance from the street side of the building. Position 2 is atop the internal bridge. We'll go to that spot in just a moment and take a look from there. 3 is the sunken lounge. So let's move to spot 2. You can see the sunken lounge and why it's called that. Passengers could sit here and enjoy drinks while keeping tabs on their flights by looking at the big departures arrivals display. Notice there's a Lockheed Constellation just outside. We'll climb aboard and talk about this later in the video. I want to talk about that departures arrivals board because it's a pretty big deal. This one and many others were made in Italy by a clock manufacturer that's been around since the 1730s. It's fully restored and functional. They update the messages on the board every few minutes. Each character in the display is changed mechanically via electric controls, so all the boards in the terminal could update at the same time. And when they did that, and now when they do that, they make a mechanical chattering sound, something like a really fast typewriter. Unfortunately, I couldn't record it for you because of the copyright issue with the 60s background music. Back in the time when these boards were in use, when flight information would update, you knew it because every one of these things in the terminal started making noise. I clearly remember that sound from when I was a child, and it was really cool to hear one of these in action again. I can't imagine the cost of restoring this thing to operating condition, and there are a few of them in the hotel, and at least 2 of them still work, the 2 big ones. So let's turn around 180 degrees and look towards the entrance. Once there, again, we see our blue VW bus. We have another fully functional departures arrival board, and when I say functional, I don't mean it's showing today's flights. There are airlines on this list, including TWA, that don't even exist anymore. But it updates to give the sensation of being in an airport in the 1960s. Note the nautical ship-style ventilation outlets near the entrance doors. They wanted to make sure that someone walking in on a cold day would be warm the second they stepped foot inside, or cool in the summer. These still work and work well. Let's turn 90 degrees to the left. To the right of the Y in the path is the Paris Cafe. Let's take a closer look. It has rave reviews. I hate to do this, but I gotta be me. I think there's a bit of an Emperor's New Clothes scenario going on here. I found the cafe to be, let me put it this way, my hamburger was $26 and was about as good as an $8 hamburger from an upper-end fast food outlet like maybe a Five Guys, and significantly less good than a burger from a mid-level chain like Texas Roadhouse. The service was also poor, except for the lady who checked my vaccine card when I entered. She was very nice. On that note, this was the only location in this New York hotel to require you to show your papers before entering. Back to our spot on the bridge. To the left is the Lisbon Lounge. Looks nice. I didn't eat there. I assume it's the same food and pricing as the Paris Cafe. On the left side of the picture, about mid-level, you can see part of the sign that says Hughes Wing. Let's pan left a bit more. Here we have another circular bar. It's a twin to the one we saw when we entered the building. To the far left, you can see the sunken lounge. People still sit there and enjoy their drinks they got at the circular bars. And under the Hughes Wing sign is the pedestrian tube that leads to the terminal and to the Hughes Wing hotel rooms. To stay oriented, let's face the entrance again. Now we'll turn 90 degrees to the right. From here we see a section with historical TWA uniforms. This was also the area where Pope John Paul visited. We'll see that area later. Let's walk by that uniform display. TWA's flight attendant uniforms were created by some of the most well-known fashion designers of their respective eras. They were stunning. Who recognizes that blue Samsonite? Those were really popular at one time. The next four are from a designer named Valentino. Apparently he liked scarves. All these colors, they were really something. Here's an item I'm more familiar with, a pilot's flight case. I still carry the type on the left. I might be one of the last people using these, but I like them. Sometimes the old ways are still the best. Here's a shot of those Valentino uniforms. I don't know much about fashion, but you can pause and read more about this if you want to. Now, while I don't know much about fashion, I do know about the aircrew road warrior lifestyle, and with that knowledge, I have decided that this is the best flight attendant uniform of all time, although I have to say I'm somewhat partial to that bare midriff design currently used by the Sri Lankan flight attendants. That somehow still looks classy. Anyway, what makes this uniform so great? Note the attractive triangular TWA logo on the right shoulder. I like the way it looks and requires no attachment hardware that's easy to lose at layovers, like so many emblems on today's uniforms do. But there's more to it. Let's take a closer look. Above the embroidery is a triangular flap which can be released via the button and used to cover the envelope so that flight attendants could smoke, drink, or engage in other airline prohibited activities without having to change clothes. Here's more information on that design. That's about all I have for fashion, except that later we're going to have lunch with an actual New York fashion model I met in the lobby. For now, let's go outside and take a look at that Citroën Traction Avant. These cars came out in 1934, were built until about 1957. By the standards of 1934, they were quite advanced. Of course, production was interrupted by World War II. After the war, France just picked up where they left off with the car's production and started building traction Avants again. These were unit body cars instead of the body on frame type. There are pros and cons to each design, but unit body construction is lighter, very strong, and has production advantages, which is why it's the type that won out, because today nearly every mass-produced car is of the unit body type. But in 1934, that was pretty unusual. The Traction Avant is also front-wheel drive, which is more or less what the name Traction Avant means. The engine is in there with the flywheel end forward and the transaxle forward of the engine. Normally, front-wheel drive cars have terrible weight distribution, but this configuration puts the engine behind the front axles, helping its balance and thus its handling. There are three basic front-wheel drive configurations, plus some others that are very uncommon. But anyway, normally, either you have the engine behind the transaxle as used here, engine in front of the transaxle, which is popular in some Audis, some Renaults, Chryslers, a few others, and the most common setup, which is with the engine in there sideways and the transaxle off to one side or the other. I've driven all three of these configurations, and the engine behind the transaxle is by far the best for performance, although it has other downsides. There were various engines in these things through the years. They were never performance cars, but they could do about 60 miles per hour, which was respectable in the mid-1930s, but way behind American car standards in the 1950s. Interestingly, that transaxle they used had an aluminum case, which was rare at the time, and it was very strong. In fact, so strong and so light that it was used successfully in Formula One cars, specifically this one. Back inside the TWA hotel, we find a bank of old rotary dial phones. They still work and still cost 10 cents to make a call. Phone calls for a long time cost 10 cents. That's where the term drop a dime comes from. If we look closely, we can see the perforated metal walls around each phone for sound deadening. These work quite well. I'm sure some of you remember phone banks with these types of walls. They were common at one time. Again, we're up on our bridge and looking towards the entrance. Note the way the supports for the arrivals departure board and the counter in front of it seems to rise almost organically from the ground. From here, it sort of looks like the surfaces are polished concrete, but they're not, it's tile. Let's go down there and take a better look. The tile on the surfaces here and just about everywhere in the main building, walls, stairs, floors, everything. Those tiles are called penny tiles. They're a bit smaller than a penny. The main reason for using them is because they're so small they can be used to cover surfaces with complex compound curves, and they really took advantage of this during construction of the building, which is a big part of what gives it such a unique look. Everything seems to just flow together. I have a very foggy memory of my father installing these types of tiles in a bathroom in our house. I'm not sure of the details, but what I remember is that the tiles are not placed individually, at least not normally. They came on sheets of a lattice-like fabric, or maybe the lattice was made of very thin metal, I don't know. But you would put the grout down, then put the sheet over it and press it down and wipe off the excess grout. So it wasn't as time-consuming to set up as it initially looks, but it was still a big job, and again, this stuff is everywhere in the building. Here is a BMW Isetta near the check-in counter. While France wasn't too badly damaged during the war, at least not in comparative terms, Germany was. The Americans bombed German industry into rubble, and then bombed the rubble into smaller pieces of rubble. However, Germany, being full of Germans, managed to start exporting Volkswagens in 1947. However, much of Europe was too poor even for Volkswagens. So there was an idea to build microcars, and there were several of these things. And the BMW Isetta is one of them. Microcars were not just small cars. They weren't thought of just as small cars, but sort of as alternatives to scooters. One of the various microcars, I have to say, the Isetta was one of the worst. It has some innovative features, like the whole front of the car acting as a door. But overall, it's a terrible vehicle. I don't want to spend too much time on this because we have a lot of other fish to fry. So I'm not going to go over every variation of these cars. I'm just speaking about them generally, and hopefully I don't upset the BMW Isetta people too much. These things were built from about 1955 until about 1962. I say about because it's tough to pin this down exactly, as various manufacturers built them, not just BMW. The car was originally an Italian design. They had less than 10 horsepower from their two-stroke engine. Top speed was officially 47 miles per hour, but to do that, it had to be a nearly new vehicle in a perfect state of tune with good air pressure in the tires. Any real-world imperfections and the top speed dropped to the low 40s, and it took over a minute to get there. Originally, these were designed as three-wheeled cars with a single wheel in the back, which was the drive wheel. However, they rolled over so easily they had to make it into a four-wheeled car, which they did, and this is one of those. Notice that the rear track is much more narrow than the front. That's very unusual, but there's a reason for it. There is no differential in this thing, so the two wheels in the rear have to turn at the same speed all the time. Thus, when you go around a corner, the tires scuff a bit and they don't last long. This contributes to the car's incredibly poor handling and road manners. On the other hand, it kept costs down because, well, there's no differential and only one brake was needed for both rear wheels. So it has no performance, terrible road manners, and the fuel economy wasn't that good. At best, you could get 43 miles per gallon from the little BMW's two-stroke engine. The problem was that the car's main competition in the microcar world was the Fiat 500, which could get 50 miles per gallon from its four-stroke engine, and a typical late 1950s version could go 65 miles an hour with its 21 horsepower engine, all while having quite good road manners, and in fact it was popular to race these things at one time. Speaking of the Fiat 500, there is a version of it here at the hotel. It's a Fiat 500 Jolly, which is a 500 changed into what you see here. This was not a factory Fiat conversion. This was done by Ghia. Today people get all worked up over figuring out if a Jolly is a real one or a regular 500 that someone converted later. The way I see it, they're all conversions. Either way, I thought it was cool to see it here, and no, I don't have any idea if it's one of those originally made into a Jolly by Ghia or one somebody did later. Here is the hotel's food court, where I ate most of my meals. There are quite a few interesting things in here, at least two of which can be seen in this picture, a car and a Coke machine. I had lunch here with a model. True story, I'll get back to that later. Under the hotel, they built this new office and meeting complex, all in a 1960s TWA theme. I think they did a great job. This area was closed off to the public, which is why it's so empty. The things I do for you guys. Notice the TWA emblem on the lower floor. It's hard to see, so we'll move along the upper walkway to a midpoint and look down onto it. All along that walkway are meeting rooms like this one. On the lower level is a replica TWA galley. Let's take a closer look at that cart. Airline food was pretty good back then. I have memories of that. Below the food, you can see the TWA magic board. This kept the kids entertained. It was a board with vinyl or vinyl-like stickers in various shapes that would stick to the board. I'm really not sure if they were vinyl, but whatever. They stuck to the board and could be peeled back off and put back on very easily. So kids could make shapes of things like airplanes, cars, buildings, horses, whatever. There were a lot of different shapes and sizes you could attach to the board. In the bottom left corner, we have the Roundup brand of candy cigarettes. Some of our younger viewers may not realize that it used to be very common to see candy designed specifically with branding and everything to emulate cigarettes in packaging and appearance. We can see some Good and Plenty. I hated this stuff, still do. There's a Tab diet soda that was popular at one time. I think that just died out maybe 15 years ago or something. Not really sure. I know it's gone now. That's it for the new construction lower area. I heard that there was a Jag XKE down here, which is why I went through the efforts to get down here, but I never found it. Then again, there were some doors I couldn't get past. Let's go back upstairs. This is a replica of the office of the Flight Center's designer/architect, Eero Saarinen. That's a Finnish name. Apologies for possible mispronunciation. The office is located at the terminal end of one of the two tunnels. I don't know much about building construction, but one of the things that struck me the most is that this entire building was done with only 60 architectural drawings. Not 600 or 6,000, 60. My understanding is that today it would be impossible to construct this building with so few drawings. Those 60 drawings are actually on display throughout the hotel. In this image, you can see the designer's name. Back outside of the hotel, we have a 1964 Lincoln. Lincoln was and still is the luxury division of the Ford Motor Company, and this was the Lincoln built from 1961 through 1969, so it's very much the 60s Lincoln. Furthermore, this one is a convertible. This was an expensive car. It was the height of luxury at the time, and with its 430 cubic inch, or roughly 7-liter engine, it could move pretty well. It wasn't a racy engine, but it had a lot of torque and about 320 horsepower. It was very smooth and quiet. It probably was just the right engine for the car. On the top of the dash was a sensor. You should be able to see it in this picture here. And that detected the headlights of oncoming cars and turned the bright lights of the Lincoln on or off. This was optional and was a pretty big deal in '64. Back inside, we have a replica of Howard Hughes's office. Howard Hughes effectively owned TWA. I don't think he ever held an official position within the airline. He wasn't president or CEO or something. But it was clear he was in charge, and he personally financed some of their bigger aircraft acquisitions. This office is located at the terminal end of one of the tunnels. And I hate to say this, but I think they need to put a barrier around it. People were being somewhat disrespectful to the area, and it looks to me like someone stole one of the little planes off this amazing artifact. Another departure is arrivals board. I don't think this one is functional, but again, these things are all over the place in the hotel. Back to the food court, and we have an electric tug made by Noland. Noland built golf carts, vehicles for Disneyland, and all sorts of electric vehicles. At one time, these electric tugs were a common sight at airports, but eventually, as the frequency of flights increased, the available charging time for these vehicles decreased. They had a bank of 12-volt, just regular automotive car batteries. Thus, because of the decreased charging time available, ultimately these things were replaced by tugs with internal combustion engines. But sometimes you still see these old Nolan Electrics around. They were apparently quite well made. In the old days, airplanes were more likely to catch on fire during engine start, so it was standard practice to have one of these big rolly fire extinguishers standing by any time an airliner was starting up. Even today, in addition to the onboard extinguishing requirements, or extinguisher requirements, I should say, you'll still see these big rolling extinguishers, and especially at military airports. I'm not sure about this, but I think it's a requirement at military airports. Anyway, moving on. Here's a restored Coca-Cola vending machine, only 10 cents. It's not operational. If it was, I would have bought one. But it is interesting. Sodas now cost about $1.50 from a vending machine, more at an airport, so that's a good comparison of cost then and now. At one end of the tunnels, you can find a room that's set up as a family room from about 1964. Some of you may recognize the Viewmaster. I sure remember those. Or playing Pit. Interestingly, I remember Pit, but the version I played came with a big bell, like a front desk bell you ring to get the clerk to come or something. That box doesn't look big enough for the bell, so there must have been different versions. I also see Chinese checkers there. That was very popular in the 60s and 70s. There's more stuff here, including a couple of plastic car models, and there's a Barbie dream house coming up. While exploring the hotel, I saw two younger people with some fancy camera equipment. My initial assumption was they were making a video about the TWA hotel, as I was. Judging by their equipment, it looked to be a much more serious effort than mine. I was walking around relatively shabbily dressed, taking pictures with my cell phone. So I approached them, a young man, a young woman, and asked if they were making a little documentary about the hotel. They seemed a bit nervous talking to me, so I bid them good day and walked off to continue my own exploration. To my surprise, while eating lunch in the food court, the young lady, who turned out to be a New York fashion model, and the young man, who turned out to be a professional fashion photographer, sat down with me for lunch. The man's name was Clovis. That's a rare name. I actually had a relative named Clovis. The woman's name is Susie, S-U-S-I, a little bit of an alternate spelling. Here's a picture of Susie and I together, which was taken right after lunch. She's half Brazilian and half Italian. She speaks 4 languages, and I believe English is actually her 4th. She speaks English perfectly well, but is a little bit shy or nervous about speaking it, which is why she seemed nervous to me when I first approached her and Clovis. Turns out she isn't shy at all and is quite the world traveler, and as a result of her modeling, she has opportunities to make YouTube videos from all around the world. She tells great stories and has a YouTube channel, as you can see here. I told her that based on her stories and how well she converses, she should make her videos in English. I think then more people would subscribe to her channel. Most of her videos have closed captioning in English, but that's still really limiting her reach. I put a link in the description, so if you want to go and subscribe to her channel and leave a comment, I'm sure she would appreciate it. I had a great time talking to her. She was very nice. Back to cars. I don't think the VW bus needs much of an introduction. Rear engine, air-cooled, no performance, but a decent people mover. When I was a kid, most families had the big American station wagons, but a few had one of these as their family vehicle. The first time I rode in one, I was probably about 6 or 7 years old. I remember being a bit disappointed that it wasn't as big inside as I expected from seeing the outside. My 7-year-old brain didn't quite realize, before I got into it, that the engine and transaxle had to go somewhere, and that somewhere is in the back of the bus, where it takes up a fair bit of room. Still, they could seat the same number of people as the big 3-row American wagons, with about the same amount of cargo, and in an overall smaller package. Although, in another case of no free lunch, that comes at an expense in performance and safety. The driver of the bus is the crumple zone, and the brakes were terrible. I would still love to have one, though. I think they're really cool. The last car to talk about is this 1966 Chrysler Newport. Chrysler is the luxury brand of Chrysler Corporation, above Dodge and Plymouth. It's normally the top brand of Chrysler Corporation. There's a few years where the top brand was Imperial, and other years where the Imperial was a car within the Chrysler brand. In any case, Chrysler is comparable to General Motors' Cadillac or Ford Motor Company's Lincoln division. In 1966, within the Chrysler division lineup, the Newport was the low-priced car, which made it a pretty good deal because it has the same chassis, engine, transmission, suspension, and brakes as the more upscale Chryslers like the New Yorker, but differed mostly in standard equipment and available options, with some minor variations in appearance. These luxury six-seaters had a great deal of comfort, nice seats, smooth ride, great heating and air conditioning, but on the downside, terrible handling. Braking was on par with other 1966 cars. It would normally have drum brakes all the way around, but they were pretty big drums. The standard engine was the 383 with a two-barrel carb, low compression, and single exhaust. I suspect that's what this car has. I didn't open the hood. The two-barrel 383 is okay. I don't really like it. It will move the car down the road. It's okay for towing, but it just has no performance due to an utter lack of manifold pressure. I really dislike the two-barrel 383s. The engine itself, though, has some good potential. But it just gets hamstrung by that two-barrel carb and little single exhaust. In 1966, they built the Newports in 5 major variants: two-door hardtop, four-door hardtop, four-door sedan, which is what we see here, as well as a town sedan, which had additional windows, and of course a convertible. Of all the cars at the TWA Hotel, at least the ones I found, I think this one best represents what a typical TWA pilot, senior mechanic, or executive would have been driving in the mid to late 60s. The Newport offered luxury and size at a price point that was very attractive. If desired, you could get one of these Newports with quite a bit of performance. Chrysler offered an optional upgraded suspension, which improved its handling tremendously. It was a night and day difference. They also offered front disc brakes. There were 2 powerful engine options. First, a 4-barrel 383. This option, if combined with the suspension upgrade and disc brakes, turned the Newport into an almost fun-to-drive luxury barge. For those really wanting more performance, a 440 4-barrel dual exhaust engine was available. A 2-door Newport with a 440 wasn't quite a muscle car, but it was darn close. It's what I would call a senior muscle car, or maybe a luxury muscle car. Sort of like a Buick Riviera or a Pontiac Grand Prix. A 440 Newport with an automatic and a 323 sure grip differential could run a 15-second quarter mile, or low 15s anyway, and had a top speed of 130 miles an hour, which was right there with most any automatic transmission-equipped muscle car in 1966. During the late 1950s, TWA's route structure was quite impressive. They did all this flying with piston-powered airliners. The Lockheed Constellation was their plane of choice. They started using them in 1945. In 1957, TWA started flying the Starliner variant, which was the final version of this plane. And that's what we have here at the hotel. The plane is open. You can walk around the outside of it, but you can't go into it until 4 p.m. And later. And it has a very nice bar in the back and a pretty comfy section to hang out in. The Lockheed Starliner had a cruise speed of about 300 miles per hour and a maximum speed of nearly 380 miles per hour. It was a fast airliner, and it had a range of over 6,000 miles and a pretty decent payload. A plane like this can really use its own video, but in the interest of brevity, I'll focus on what I think are 3 of the more interesting technical aspects of the airplanes. First of all, we have the engines. They're Wright 3350 duplex Cyclones. They have 18 cylinders with about 3,350 cubic inches of displacement, and they put out 3,400 horsepower each. What's amazing about them is that while they're larger and more powerful than the World War II era Pratt & Whitney R2800s, in cruise they burn about the same amount of fuel. Now, a big part of the reason for this is something called the power recovery turbine. So let's take a look at it. I've put a green circle around an exhaust stack. Notice it looks odd because it's connected to something flat and round via a V-band clamp or some similar type of clamping mechanism. That's an odd design for an exhaust stack, but there is a reason for it. Now I've circled a turbine, which you can see down low on the engine. There are 3 of these on each engine, and exhaust from 6 of the 18 cylinders passes through each one, forcing it to spin. Normally when you see a turbine in the exhaust, it's for a turbocharger, but that's not what this is. It's a turbine that spins really fast, and via a shockingly complex mechanism involving a lot of gear reduction, it transfers that power back into the crankshaft. In other words, the exhaust energy helps to spin the crankshaft, resulting in more power and more efficiency. This system alone could be the subject of an entire video or more. In my view, it's a near miracle of engineering. The system, meaning all 3 turbines on each engine, contributes about 450 horsepower to the engine's total of 3,400. This sounds great, but sadly the system was ahead of its time. They didn't quite have the metallurgy to make this work out, and the extra heat put a lot of extra stress on the exhaust valves and related components, exhaust guides and so forth. And that led to premature wear. Mechanics called these things they called them parts recovery turbines. The real name was power recovery turbine, of course. But they called them parts recovery turbines because they caught so many failed parts that were trying to exit out through the exhaust. The only fix for this was more frequent intervals for inspection and replacements of parts, which is what they did, but that further drove up the already high cost of operating the airplanes. Soon the jet airliners arrived, and that really ended any further development of this technology, which is a bit sad. I've talked about that before. The jet age, while awesome, I mean, I'm not down on turbine engines at all. They're wonderful, but because the jets came in, it ended a lot of piston engine development stuff that was pretty cool. This is one of those things. Moving on to the tail. The triple tail was an unusual design, and it did not offer any real performance advantages, but what it did do is allow the plane to fit into TWA's hangars they had at the time. I actually met one of the Lockheed engineers on his ranch in Arizona who worked on this tail. His name was Chambers. This was back around, I'm going to say 1985. Unfortunately, I didn't ask him many questions. I wish I would have. Last, notice how all of the leading edges of the wings and tail are black, same with the inboard section of the propeller blades. In the case of this non-flying example, that's just paint. But originally, that area would have been black because of the optional de-icing equipment you could get on these planes. On the propellers, these were electrically heated. They only needed them on the inboard portion of the propeller blades because the outboard portion just moves too fast for ice to adhere to it. The wings and tail had rubber boots on the leading edges. Ice only forms on the leading edges of things, by the way. Now, underneath those boots, there were little rubber tubes running under them that could inflate with compressed air. So the pilot could inflate the leading edge of the wing to break the ice off of the wings. These boots work pretty well, although every time you inflate them, and I know this from experience, every time you inflate them, a little bit of ice stays on the boot and it doesn't come off again. So after some number of inflations, they don't do much good anymore because too much ice is built up on them and it's just not coming off. So these buy the pilot time to get out of the icing conditions, and plenty of time. It's not an issue if the pilot's planning properly, but they don't give the airplane the ability to stay in icing conditions for hours at a time. Moving inside the plane, we have the cockpit. You can see that the flight engineer had most of the controls for the aircraft systems. The pilots had relatively few. They mostly just flew the plane. This was a pretty cool airplane to be an engineer on, and typically engineers would then upgrade into a pilot's seat. That had something to do with the way airlines hired back in those days. Just aft of the cockpit is this navigator station. Up through the mid-1960s, it was common to have a navigator on airliners for long-range operations. When I first started flying for a living, which was in the late 1980s, you could still get that navigator rating, although nobody did because there was no longer any use for it. Today that rating is long gone. The FAA no longer administers that test. In fact, some airliners, including the Constellation, had a flight crew of 5, a captain, co-pilot, flight engineer, navigator, and radio operator. Technology has reduced that to 2 in modern airliners. The flight engineer's gone, navigator's gone, and radio operator's gone. And there was no radio operator position still installed in this particular airplane, although it probably did have one at one time. Aft of that, we have a nice lounge area and a bar in the back. Interestingly, here I ran into Clovis, the photographer, again. And this time he was with a group of models. I didn't talk to them, but I talked to the fashion coordinator who puts these photo shoots together. I found it interesting to talk to her, and she told me that this plane and the hotel in general provide a lot of great backgrounds for fashion photography, so I guess it's pretty popular for that. Outside of the plane, we have a more modern tug and baggage cart. These types are still in common use today. Here in this building, they rent roller skates, and when the weather's nice, and I was there when it was really cold, but when the weather's nice, this area near the plane serves as an outdoor roller skating rink, which is pretty cool. I have to say I had a great time at the TWA Hotel. They did a good job of preserving the heritage of the TWA Flight Center, the TWA airline, and 1960s air travel in general, all while making the thing into a darn good hotel. The rooms, which I didn't photograph, I probably should have a very strong 1960s feel. Hopefully you enjoyed this tour of the hotel with me. I'm not turning my channel into a travel channel. I normally just put little travel things at the end of my aircraft or automotive videos. My next video will be back to our regularly scheduled programming. In the meantime, you might check out Susie's channel if you like travel stuff, and tell her I said hi. Goodbye for now, and have a great day.